This is not a narcotics raid. This is not a piracy operation. This is a NATO force seizing a rusty ghost ship belonging to Russia's Shadow Fleet. On October 2nd, 2025, Putin's hybrid war hit the hardest rock in the heart of Europe. The French Navy and elite special operations forces seized the Borakai, a Russian Shadow Fleet oil tanker anchored off the coast of Le Havre, France, in a dawn raid. The reason? This ship is suspected of having launched the mysterious drones that, just a week earlier, paralyzed a European capital, Copenhagen, for hours, stranding thousands of people and causing millions of euros worth of chaos. For years, Putin has been attacking the West, hiding behind a strategy he calls the grey zone. He has launched cyber attacks, spread disinformation campaigns, and hinted at targeting undersea internet cables. The Shadow Fleet of over 600 rusty, uninsured tankers they built to evade sanctions was the darkest tool of this grey zone. Until now, these ships were merely ghosts carrying illegal oil, but not anymore. Now, they are Trojan Horses, anchored in European ports, disguised as civilian cargo ships. And now, they are using a new form of threat: swarms of drones launched from civilian-disguised vessels. These attacks were low-intensity operations that the Kremlin could always deny, but the West could not easily respond to with direct military action. But France ended that game on October 2nd. The bluff was called, and now the eyes of the world are on what French commandos will find on the deck of that rusty tanker. Because if suspicions are confirmed, this will not just be the end of a single ship, but the beginning of the collapse of the entire Shadow Fleet financing Putin's war, and with it, the entire hybrid warfare doctrine. For the hunt has begun, and there is no escape from this hunt. The image of black-clad commandos landing by helicopter on an oil tanker off the coast of France sealed the moment when hybrid warfare crossed the threshold onto the European stage. And it is now impossible to describe the rest of the story in terms of a mere maritime violation or customs control. Because this operation was not just about seizing a ship. It all began a week earlier when NATO's signals intelligence units detected suspicious, short-range, encrypted radio signals coming from an old, rusty Liberian-flagged oil tanker sailing near the Danish coast at the time of the attack. The ship's name was Borakai. On paper, it belonged to a front company in the United Arab Emirates and was an anonymous part of that notorious 600-ship Shadow Fleet transporting Russian oil to Asia. However, there was no logical commercial reason for it to be in that location at that time, on that day. NATO took the ship under surveillance. An Atlantique II maritime patrol aircraft belonging to the French Navy watched the ship from the sky for hours. Satellite images showed unusual activity around some containers on the ship's deck. Activity that should not have been present on a normal tanker. At that moment, all the pieces of the puzzle came together. Russia had turned these civilian-looking tankers into Trojan Horses, not only to circumvent sanctions, but also to attack NATO. It became clear how dozens of kamikaze drones could be launched from a module placed on the deck of an oil tanker, looking like a standard shipping container. These ships were no longer just smugglers. They were floating terrorist bases capable of causing panic in European ports. Putin was now trying to win the war he couldn't win with his army, using pirate ships carrying oil. When the intelligence reports reached the Élysée Palace in Paris via NATO channels, President Emmanuel Macron faced one of the most critical decisions of his presidency, and perhaps of modern European history. The file before him contained not just suspicion, but an accusation based on strong evidence. A Russian ship was heading towards French territorial waters to attack an ally's capital. This was a Rubicon moment. Launching a military operation in French territorial waters against a Russian ship with civilian status was one of the riskiest, most daring steps taken since the start of the war. It could have triggered a diplomatic crisis, even an uncontrolled military conflict. But what was the alternative? Doing nothing, allowing the Borakai to continue on its course, would have meant giving Putin tacit approval to continue his audacious attacks. That would have meant the effective collapse of NATO's deterrence and the principle of collective defense. The decision was made after hours of tense meetings. The Rubicon would be crossed. France would call Putin's bluff. Orders were relayed to the Ministry of Defense and the Navy. The Borakai tanker would be stopped. The elite French naval commandos were ordered to stand by. The operation was carried out at dawn, with absolute secrecy, speed, and overwhelming force. Two NH-90 helicopters approached the tanker, flying low just above the sea, undetected by radar. At the same time, 4 Zodiac speedboats cut through the waves and surrounded the ship on all sides. When the helicopters hovered over the Borakai's deck, the commandos rappelled onto the deck within seconds. The stunned crew of the Borakai found themselves lying face down on the deck before they knew what was happening. There was no resistance. The ship's bridge was immediately taken under control. The entire operation lasted less than 10 minutes from start to finish. The French flag was hoisted on the mast of the ship belonging to the Russian Shadow Fleet. This was not just the seizure of a ship, but also the delivery of a very clear message to the Kremlin. The game is over. To understand this extraordinary military operation, we must rewind time 1 week to September 24th to 25th, 2025. It was an ordinary day. Thousands of passengers were filling the terminals, about to begin their vacations or business trips, until the first anomaly appeared on the screens in the air traffic control tower. Radars detected a series of unidentified slow-moving objects flying at low altitude. First 1, then 5, then more than 20 small, hard-to-detect drones occupied the airport's sensitive approach and departure corridors. This was not a military attack. It was a modern and ruthless version of the blind the bear strategy adapted for civilian infrastructure. The goal was not to blind a radar station, but to blind a country's economic and logistical heart, to paralyze it. An emergency protocol similar to the Havre plan was immediately activated. This is the worst-case scenario an airport can face. All takeoffs were immediately halted. Dozens of planes approaching for landing began to circle dangerously in the air. The runways were cleared. Controllers in the tower tried to safely divert the planes in the air to other airports, while also trying to understand what the drones were doing. The result was complete chaos. Within hours, hundreds of flights were cancelled. Tens of thousands of passengers were stranded in terminals. The economic damage reached millions of euros within minutes. Cargo operations stopped, supply chains were disrupted, and Denmark's largest gateway to the world was shut down. But the real damage was psychological. The fact that a NATO capital, one of Europe's safest cities, could be held hostage for hours by such a simple and inexpensive method sent shockwaves across the continent. This was an act of terrorism. Its purpose was not only to cause disruption, but also to spread fear and a sense of vulnerability. The message, if this can happen in Copenhagen, it could happen tomorrow at Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, or Frankfurt, reverberated throughout all of Europe's capitals. Danish authorities were stunned, but red alerts were sounding at NATO headquarters in Brussels and at the intelligence services of member countries. Western intelligence services launched an intense investigation into who was behind this sophisticated attack. This could not be the work of a simple terrorist organization. The timing of the attack, the choice of targets, and the technological profile of the drones used screamed of state intelligence and military planning. All fingers pointed to one address: Moscow. But there was a problem. The famous deniability veil that forms the basis of Putin's hybrid warfare doctrine. There was no concrete evidence that the attack had been carried out directly from Russian territory or a known military base. However, with the intelligence unit's discovery and the French Special Forces raid on the ship, everything suddenly came to light. When the news spread around the world with a short and clear statement from the French Ministry of Defense, a diplomatic earthquake occurred. The expected reaction from Moscow was a predictable scenario: anger, denial, and condemnation. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova described the incident as a despicable violation of international law and an act of state piracy. Russia immediately demanded the ship's release and an official apology from France. But behind these angry and loud statements, there was obvious panic in the diplomatic channels monitored by Western intelligence services. Putin's most cunning plan, his most secret operation, had been exposed. The veil of deniability had been torn. Statements from Washington, London, and Berlin, however, formed a stark contrast. There was full and unconditional support for France. The NATO Secretary-General said in a statement in Brussels, "Any hybrid attack on alliance territory, whenever and wherever it occurs, will be met with a resolute response." This was a combined, coordinated move on the chessboard. France moved its pawn, and NATO stood behind it with all its heavy pieces, checkmating the Kremlin. The strategic consequences of this operation are much greater than a rusty tanker being seized. This is the moment when two fundamental hybrid warfare doctrines, developed by the brightest minds of the GRU and FSB, in which Putin has invested billions of dollars over 20 years, collapsed simultaneously. The first doctrine to be undermined was the grey zone doctrine. This was the cornerstone of Putin's foreign policy. Its philosophy was simple: to constantly wear down NATO with low-level, deniable attacks that would not trigger a conventional military response, paralyzing its decision-making mechanisms and creating divisions within the alliance. The goal was to keep the West constantly on the defensive and waiting anxiously, unsure where the next move would come from. The Copenhagen attack was a perfect example of this doctrine. However, France's military operation declared that this threshold had been crossed and that there was no longer any grey zone. Paris's message was clear. The moment we identify the source of the attack, whether it be a civilian-looking ship, a tourist group, or a cyber actor, we will consider it an act of war and respond with military force. That foggy, ambiguous grey zone, Putin's favorite playground, was suddenly illuminated and transformed into a dangerous red line. Putin's protective shield of uncertainty was shattered. The civilian shield doctrine was also debunked. This is one of Russia's most unethical and dangerous tactics. He thought he could make civilian ships, civilian infrastructure, and even nuclear power plants like Zaporizhia untouchable by using them for military purposes. He bet that the West would be terrified of attacking civilian targets, causing unwanted civilian casualties and escalating the war. The Borakai tanker was a floating symbol of this doctrine. However, the Boracay operation shattered this shield. France reminded us of one of the most fundamental principles of international law and the laws of war. A civilian object, a civilian platform, loses its civilian protection status the moment it is used for a military attack and becomes a legitimate military target. France told Putin, "If you turn your ships into Trojan horses, we will treat them like warships." The simultaneous collapse of these two doctrines left Putin in a diplomatic zugzwang situation. He was now trapped. Now imagine Vladimir Putin in his situation room in Moscow, evaluating his options with his generals and advisors. The options are one worse than the other. The first option is to retreat and do nothing. This would mean tacitly accepting France's action, allowing the ship to be searched and possibly its evidence displayed to the world. This would show the entire world, and more importantly, the hawks in his own country, that NATO can seize Russian assets with impunity. This would be a humiliating defeat and a sign of great weakness, perceived as the Tsushima of the 21st century. The second option is to escalate. But how? By attacking a French warship or civilian vessel? This would directly trigger NATO's Article 5, the principle of collective defense. This would mean an all-out war that Russia could never win conventionally. By blockading the Baltic Sea or the English Channel? This would instantly end all of Russia's remaining maritime trade. This was a perfect diplomatic and military trap set by France and NATO behind it. A move forcing Putin to either retreat in a humiliating manner or escalate in a way that would lead to disaster. Putin, using his favorite weapon, hybrid warfare, has been caught in his own trap. What happens now? The answer to this question lies hidden in Putin's darkest nightmares. Borakai is the first domino to fall, and the hand that pushed that domino was France's determined hand. This operation is irreversible and sets a historic precedent. This is the moment when international law and maritime rules are being rewritten. Now, every member of Russia's massive 600-ship shadow fleet is seen not just as a sanctions evader, but as a potential Trojan horse, a potential military threat, and therefore a legitimate military target. This reclassification changes everything. To understand the scale of this threat, we must understand what the shadow fleet is and why it is so vital to Putin. This fleet was a brilliant but equally unethical solution created by the Kremlin when Western sanctions began to strangle the Russian economy at the start of the war. Hundreds of old, rusty, often dangerous and poorly maintained tankers were purchased or leased. These ships were registered to shell companies that no one had ever heard of. They constantly switched flags between countries like Liberia and Panama to conceal their identities. And most importantly, they turned themselves into ghosts by turning off their AIS transponders to hide their locations. This fleet had one sole purpose: to secretly sell Russian oil, subject to sanctions, to world markets primarily India and China, thereby funneling the hundreds of millions of dollars needed daily to fund Putin's brutal war machine in Ukraine into the Kremlin's coffers. The Shadow Fleet was not merely a trick, it was the last lifeline of the Russian economy. It was the Achilles heel that enabled Putin to continue his war. France's operation is a scalpel strike that cuts off this lifeline. The consequences will be a chain reaction of disasters for Russia. And this disaster will begin not at sea, but in the offices of London's financial centres. International marine insurance companies, especially Lloyd's of London and the P&I clubs, which are the heart of the industry, live by risk analysis. And after France's move, insuring a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker is no longer a calculable risk. It is suicide. These ships are no longer high risk. They are now in the guaranteed military target category. No insurance company will insure a ship that could be seized or shot at any moment by a NATO force. This means these ships will instantly become financial lepers. Insurance policies will be cancelled one by one, and new ones will never be written. An uninsured ship is a ghost in the modern world, and this topples a second, more deadly domino: logistical paralysis. An uninsured tanker carrying 100,000 tons of crude oil is a floating time bomb, and no sane country in the world will allow this bomb to enter its port. Egypt, the Suez Canal Authority, cannot risk these uninsured, rusty tankers blocking the canal and paralyzing global trade. They will not be allowed to pass. Turkey, hiding behind the Montreux Convention, will block or indefinitely delay the passage of these security risk ships through the Istanbul and Dardanelles Straits. Rotterdam, Singapore, Shanghai, all major ports around the world will close their doors to them one by one to avoid the risk of a potential environmental disaster, or worse, a potential terrorist platform like the one in Copenhagen. This means that a fleet of 600 ships will effectively be stranded at sea. Where will these ships go? Where will they unload their cargo? Where will they change their crew? Where will they refuel, replenish their water, and obtain food? Answer: nowhere. This fleet will begin to drift aimlessly in international waters, unable to dock at ports, uninsured, unwanted pariahs. Over time, neglect will increase, crew mutinies will begin, and these massive tankers will turn into rusting piles of metal in the middle of the sea, floating graves of Russia's failed strategy. Putin's greatest asset will suddenly become his greatest and most shameful burden. To see more analyses like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support enables us to continue producing independent and in-depth content. See you in the next video. Take care.